for leading and contributing to these rich conversations about working across boundaries to tackle immense 21st century challenges. And I want to go beyond providing just a tidy summary of the previous 24 hours proceedings, but not so far that I veer into the mad rantings and ravings of a recovering grantmaker or obnoxious academic. So quick show of hands. Who here has learned something new that will change how you work in some way? So quick show of hands. Okay, good. Who has heard something that you disagree with over the past 24 hours? Okay, good, yeah. For those of you who didn't put up your hand, don't worry, I'll give you something to disagree with. Okay, who voted in advance polls for Monday's election already? Nice, wow, very civically engaged. Who will still be deciding who you vote for the night of the election, or the day of the election? Yeah, that's me too. And who would be tempted in this election were they offered a none of the above box? I loved Martha Hall Finley's analogy last night where she said, this election feels like shopping in a dollar store. I thought, yeah, that nailed it. The title of this symposium, Working Across Boundaries, is deceptively simple to say. But boundaries are powerful, be they geographic, institutional, or inside our head. But collaborating is messy, difficult, and let's be honest, most of the time, an awful experience. Let me start by stating the obvious. People in this room care, for sure. But you are also hungry for dialogue. Not every foundation is. For discovering breakthrough solutions, and for sharing your bumps, your bruises, your war stories, not just trumpeting your successes. Julian Norris spoke of radical curiosity, and he made us stare uncomfortably in each other's eyes. Thank you, Julian, for that. Which I imagine to include inquisitiveness and imagination, such that we are in touch with a kind of long view of history and a long view of the future. Curious about our own ancestors, a familiarity with great and timeless narratives that connect us to cultures, to thinking in 7 generations, backward, forward. You are foundations, after all, not fleeting programs or memes. As the framing of this symposium suggests, you are willing, or at least curious, to work with each other, with non-traditional allies, erstwhile adversaries, to see yourself sometimes as activists, certainly as policy changers, and as conveners and holders of space. And here we need to pause and consider the space that has been held for us, the space from which the sandstone and the brick on this magnificent hotel was quarried, the space just across the river from which I drew my first breath. This place is an ancient and a storied land, home to at least 10,000 years or more, for all intents and purposes, time immemorial, to the Niitsitapi, or Blackfoot, nation, which reaches from the North Saskatchewan River down along the Rockies, along what the Blackfoot called the backbone of the world, as far south as Yellowstone Park, what we now call Yellowstone Park in Wyoming. In 1819, the Anglo-American Convention was signed in London, England, bisecting these lands right down the middle and establishing the 49th parallel as the division between British claimed North America and American claimed Louisiana Purchase. That was the first boundary to encumber this space. Mohkinstsis, where the two rivers meet in the shape of an elbow, which we now call Calgary, named after a Scottish hamlet on the Isle of Mull, was, for 200 years, a tiny part of the vast Hudson Bay commercial monopoly called Rupert's Land, roughly contiguous with the Hudson Bay drainage basin. A land of shortgrass prairie, suffused with the scent of sage and sweetgrass, and once teeming with millions of bison. In 1870, the colonial claim on the land was transferred to Canada, forming part of the Northwest Territories. Then, on September 22nd, 1877, Treaty 7 was signed, formally acknowledging the Indigenous occupation title and rights of the Niitsitapi, which includes the Siksika, the Piikani, and the Kainai First Nations, as well as the Tsuut'ina Dene Nation, the Stoney Nakoda, and these rights are further affirmed in Section 35 of our Constitution Act. I say this because the entire story of Canadian prosperity, of social and community development, as well as charitable blunders and social engineering failures, and yes, of philanthropy in all of its forms, unfolds on this bedrock. In the 142 years that followed the signing of Treaty 7, borders and divisions became the norm. Boundaries on the landscape, but also a never-ending torrent of rules, regulations, and patronizing circumscriptions. We know some of what happened in subsequent decades, from the repugnant pass system to the horrific experience and legacy of residential schools, cultural expression, economic systems, food security, family bonds, social stability were among the things that our forebears laid waste to, often in the name of charity or civic improvement. Edward Morena from the Edge Funders Alliance refers to the imperative of making just transitions when he says creating systemic change, alternatives for a transition to a society that supports justice, equity, and the well-being of the planet. A way to get at whether we are on the right track is to ask ourselves, are we practicing our craft of philanthropy to, for, with, or of the communities and nations we purport to be allies of? Land acknowledgement strayed out of thought and time for generations. We have at long last begun, and I emphasize begun, to again acknowledge, recognizing as well the Métis Nation. It is now part of our civic habit. In addition, many of you have signed your name to the Philanthropic Community's Declaration of Action, built on the 7 sacred lessons of truth, humility, honesty, respect, courage, wisdom, and love. So I trust that all of you in this room will have done so by tomorrow, right? If you haven't already. We've heard much over the 24 hours past about the importance of polarization, new leadership, new networks, relationships, evidence-based policy, thinking differently about outcomes, technology, and systems. So I want to take each one of these in order. Polarization. Amid the challenge and opportunity of reconciliation and peace building, we remain tempted, I believe, by polarities and divisive discourse. We see the rise of profoundly antisocial social media, a tech-enabled undermining of democratic dialogue through bots, troll factories, and the so-called deep fake. Even social justice warriors on one side of the spectrum seem to give less and less quarter. Good always sucks when you can imagine utopia. But polarization can get ugly quick. White nationalism is still, stubbornly, a thing. The Prime Minister is forced to wear a bulletproof vest because of online hyperpartisan vitriol gone way too far. Our re-elected mayor, Naheed Nenshi, who we heard from this morning, saw a tenfold uptick in violent racist threats compared with past elections. And our former premier, now leader of the opposition, continues to be the receiving end of an unending blizzard of online misogyny, something every female who runs for public office, no matter the party, knows all too well. Energy war rooms, religious symbol bans, false dichotomies, all reinforce boundaries. I love oil and gas. I love everything it has done to make my life more comfortable and cosmopolitan. But I also know that we have to limit the emissions that result. I love Alberta beef, but I know I have to eat less of it. I have a problem with people who say they love Alberta beef and then cook the hell out of it. Polarization has infected philanthropy in some ugly, misanthropic ways. Some donors have weaponized their largesse through social media. Don't like York University showcasing a Palestinian artist's painting? Don't like the University of Alberta conferring an honorary doctorate on David Suzuki? well, then just loudly and tempestuously rescind your donation. At least one self-proclaimed philanthropist has even advocated publicly, online, for the killing of environmentalists. Sorta jokey, but sorta not. Despite this, I don't think we are where the US is with respect to philanthropy as a megaphone. Anand Giridharadas' blistering 2018 critique of US jumbo philanthropy, called Winners Take All, the elite charade of changing the world, makes the argument that there is a hierarchy of opinion within democratic discourse, the veracity of which matches the size of one's philanthropic pocketbook. Last night's panel discussion, organized by the Max Bell Foundation, was, I think, the opposite of this. A respectful, nuanced conversation that challenged us to think for ourselves, laying out the issue of the future of energy in Canada compellingly. The importance of the resource to the Canadian economy, contrasted with the need to transition away from hydrocarbon combustion, hits home right here, right now. The third industrial revolution, this era of petro-fueled prosperity, which has brought unmatched human development and mobility, and built this city from an RCMP detachment and trading post to the world's fifth most livable city, according to The Economist's 2019 rankings, is gradually starting to wane. We saw the graph by University of Alberta resource economist Andrew Leach last night. Mark Carney last week warned that if some companies and industries fail to adjust to this new carbon-constrained world, they will fail to exist. Albertans' prosperity has been disrupted. Many of our fellow citizens feel victimized and angry, and Greta Thunberg is here. Thunberg, critique her if you must, forces us to look in the mirror. Or in my case, at my 9-year-old daughter, who's, by the way, a dead ringer for Greta Thunberg, and admit that, yep, the house is on fire. We can blame foreign-funded radicals, but some of my best friends are foreign-funded radicals. I don't actually know that, but I should remember to ask. The real forces at play, though, are actually far more banal. Supply and demand, volatile global and regional prices, automation. But the victimization of workers is exacerbated by other megatrends. Capital markets singularly devoted to shareholder return, a growing divide between the haves and have-nots, and the relentless pathological need to grow, which skews our expectations perversely. Let me illustrate. The data from the National Energy Board shows that total Canadian oil production has been increasing every year since 2010. Keep in mind, that was a boom year, when production then averaged 2.83 million barrels a day. In 2018, it averaged 4.58 million barrels, up from 4.21 in 2017. So it's been growing. This symposium is rightly more focused not on how to shoot up yet another speedball of fleeting prosperity, but rather how to include everyone more equitably in the benefits of growth, and how to have lives that are more healthy, more fulfilling, and more connected. Oxford economist Kate Raworth contends that the purpose of all economies ought to be promoting human flourishing within a flourishing web of life. Sounds like a reasonable guidepost for philanthropy, too. Morena's challenge to philanthropy is worth repeating. How do we make just transitions? And to help, we have the UN SDGs as one set of guideposts. How many people actually use the UN SDGs in their decision-making? Yeah, a few, yeah. So philanthropy's role here is critical in bridging the divide, promoting counter-narratives to simplistic binary thinking, demonstrating alternative community futures and economic models. We are seeing, as Alan pointed out yesterday, or today, this morning, wow, it's a long day, we're moving slowly from a kind of black hat, white hat campaign mentality to something that looks like more productive collaboration. So on to new leadership. Some of the important philanthropic organizations showing leadership working across boundaries, aside from Max Bell, include Suncor Energy Foundation. Full disclosure here, Suncor is also one of our funders. And Suncor is a key supporter of the Alberta Narratives Project, which comes at a critical time to get Albertans at the table talking to each other. Also supports the Natural Step and the Energy Futures Lab. The Trottier Foundation for catalyzing the Low Carbon Cities Canada network across 7 municipalities. The Ivy Foundation, is Bruce here? Bruce? A supporter of the Transition Accelerator, Eco-Fiscal Commission, and many other 21st century bridging initiatives. From a non-foundation perspective, Brenda Kenny of Alberta Innovates also shared examples of where breakthrough successes, including but not limited to the climate energy puzzle, can happen as a result of collaborating across sectors. So leadership, to me, also looks an awful lot like Mike Lickers. Is Mike here? Mike's gone home? Somebody should give that man an Order of Canada, if he doesn't already have one. So Mike and Joey Mackinac-LaBelle shared the story of how Suncor Energy Foundation, have explored and entered into relationships with Indigenous young leaders from right across Canada. As I'm sure Mike would attest, the next generation of Indigenous youth and the next generation after that are becoming more and more powerful, and their voice and leadership will quake the very foundations of what we call Canada. Tim from the Pierre Elliott Trudeau Foundation mentioned 8 out of 20 Trudeau scholars this year, PhD scholars, are Indigenous. Incidentally, we're reminded last night that Canadians can stand to be both a bit less parochial and a bit more confident in their own problem-solving abilities, technological, political, and social. There is even a reverse brain drain happening, as Curtis Berlinguet pointed out. Wasn't he amazing, by the way? We also need to be open to renewing leadership within our organizations, a theme that Margaret Jean Mannix riffed on this afternoon, speaking about the power and value of new ideas, energy, enthusiasm that young family members can bring to a foundation. A family foundation must be extraordinarily resilient, nimble, and responsive to survive more than a couple generations of family engagement. A 4th generation governed foundation, the Carthy Foundation, has now developed a strategy to involve a 5th generation. That, to me, is remarkable. Similarly, foundations can help renew broader public leadership. The Trudeau Foundation's Canada-wide Future Forums brought together not only academics and leaders from all sectors, but also frontline workers who feel shut out of leadership opportunities. They're taking their group to Yellowknife and Washington this coming year, which is really cool, to talk about power, different ways of looking at power and consensus. New networks. The last 2 decades have seen the rise of networks, like PFC, but also many others, within philanthropy, but also in the realm of broader social impact work. We learned about the ONN-inspired ABNN, or Alberta Nonprofit Network, province-wide effort to take action on issues that affect the sector, building on, amplifying the outstanding work of the Calgary and Edmonton Chambers of Voluntary Organizations, and the many volunteer centers that dot the province. Senator Ratna Ahmedvar, marshalling her experience as former foundation and nonprofit executive, and now vice chair of the Senate Special Committee on the Charitable Sector, by the way, the report of which is the most downloaded Senate of Canada report in the history of the Senate of Canada, we heard today. The media, on the other hand, hasn't picked it up at all. She spoke of the imperative for the modern system of regulation that better acknowledges and enables a transformative role for charities and nonprofits in society. She said, "We are so essential, unfortunately we are invisible." And she also said, "Why is it so hard to do good work?" which is how the report opens. One essential function of these nonprofit networks and the underpinning the need for charitable sector public policy reform is the call for decent work. Speaking with my educator hat on, post-secondary students seek purposeful, ethical, meaningful careers with world-changing impact. And at the same time, sustainable work and career paths and inclusive, supportive workplace cultures. That's not too much to ask, is it? But without the sector embracing a decent work ethic, it's not at all clear that such students' goals would be realized in the nonprofit sector. And yet, the sector is growing in scale and importance, employing a greater and greater percentage of the population. With automation, robotics, AI, this dynamic will intensify. The most AI-proof jobs are those that require high levels of compassion, high levels of creativity, and especially both competencies in tandem. Caregivers, counselors, adult educators, artists, dramatists, and so on. But ironically, for a sector that helps build a more progressive and equitable Canada, nonprofit employment is also typically marked by precarity, lower wages, lack of benefits, including retirement planning, vis-a-vis the private and public sectors. In this light, the Atkinson Foundation's path-breaking work in sparking a decent work movement within the sector, working with ABNN, ONN, and others, could not be more timely and vital. So relationships. Relationships are critical to not just moving across boundaries, but to co-creating new futures. This involves shared learning journeys, reciprocal exchange across cultures, classes, life worlds, and above all, trust. And thank you, Julie and Norris, for this morning's exercise. These are not blithely transactional, but they are deeply human, intentional relationships. Where relationships wither, so do eventually associations. And an association-starved society is prone to corruption. Contracts don't have a bedrock of social trust. And we tend to fear both change itself and people who aren't like ourselves. In this grows authoritarian personalities who find fertile ground for their populist but often poisonous ideas. Next, we have evidence-based policy. Serial social entrepreneur and Ashoka Fellow, Sean Loney, with whom we collaborate regularly at the Institute, often speaks of the need for the nonprofit sector to, what he says, step away from the kids' table. By this, he means our default mode should not be cap in hand, hoping for some scraps of acknowledgement from funders or others, but rather that we must find our voice, that we must get much better at capturing and demonstrating our value, not give away our outcomes in the process, and that we should be at every table of every issue of any import to the common good. The notion that civil society, including charities and social enterprises of all stripes, should not have a voice in public policy or politics is not actually something endemic to this part of Canada. We did a pretty good job early on out west of eschewing the know your place Victorian manners of Upper Canada. After all, Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and Alberta were the first 3 provinces to extend the franchise to women. There's also a great story of the United Farmers of Alberta, a co-op that formed a political wing, they formed a political party. So imagine that, a civil society group forming a political party and then negotiating the right to have royalties benefit from the natural resources, the mining, the oil and gas that this province currently enjoys. So our entire story of prosperity is due to somebody who came from civil society and said, we need to be louder, more political, and more in the public arena. And thank God as a result. Bruce Laurie of the Ivy Foundation spoke about the transition to a low-carbon economy as a public policy challenge, wherein our capacity to collect, interpret, and communicate data and research, along with our ability to learn and adapt business investment tools, none of these capabilities being small feats for a nonprofit organization, are paramount to success. This is a long game, marshaling evidence, rallying support, building allies, and especially listening to and appreciating alternative points of view on the issues. It's easy to turn a small boat in radical new directions, but it's tougher to nudge a large ship. But when that ship moves, it's powerful. We also heard about how Mootart Foundation and the Margaret Wallace McCain Foundation, 2 members of the Early Childhood Development Funders Working Group, collaborated with government and providers to work for policy changes. A 10-year journey that will lead to expanded access and better quality of early childhood education and care across Canada, but there remain challenges. How do we get this on the public radar? And also, how do we actually expand the number of people working in the field to attract them to childcare vocations? Momentum CEO Jeff Loomis introduced us to the Calgary Social Policy Collaborative, which involves 11 charities working with the University of Calgary School of Public Policy to build an evidence base of effective poverty advocacy. Supported by the Max Bell Foundation, again, I can tell you that this research is also immensely useful in the classroom. It does go beyond just local insights, and there's a lot of Canada-wide trends and comparisons. As a university-based educator, I believe there's actually a depressing chasm between academic knowledge production and incentives and practical insights from the field. Good community-partnered research is exceedingly rare, so it's great to see this. The growing discussion of social R&D outside the academy is not matched inside, unfortunately. So how do we better connect our taxpayer-funded social science research, which last year alone was about $750 million just from SSHRC, Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council, with social practitioners? So we need to also think differently about outcomes. Chad Park noted last night, challenged foundations to fund emergence rather than obsessing about outcomes. We need to get more sophisticated about this. This symposium was also lucky enough to hear from two of the nation's leading developmental evaluators. Melissa Innes revealed how the Calgary Collaborative Funders Table pooled their resources to look at after-school programming and employment outcomes for vulnerable youth. The brilliant innovation of bridging the supply side of youth and youth-serving agencies with the demand side of large employers has led to even broader cross-sectoral collaboration efforts. And then Mark Cabage, the brilliant Mark Cabage, introduced us to the methodology of outcome harvesting, a tool from international development that offers a way to measure outcomes in a context of complexity. Technology, another theme. As the World Economic Forum has signaled, the fourth industrial revolution, fueled by machine learning, big data, the Internet of Things, autonomous vehicles, 3D printing, blockchain, gene editing, implantable devices, and potentially quantum computing. Some of these are with us presently, some of them are just on the frontier, but it will profoundly alter the way we live, work, and relate to one another. Philanthropy futurist Lucy Bernholtz queries that when so much of our individual and collective dependence on digital infrastructure is intensifying, and it is, how much of this is actually in the public domain? Thank you. And is there sufficient scope and concern for digital civil society? So I recently co-authored an analysis of artificial intelligence in the service of social good, which this symposium's digital content partner, Future of Good, helped disseminate and generate dialogue around. We found that what was missing is exactly what Chad Park raised last night. The tech innovation and social innovation communities, both very strong in Canada, let's not be bashful, are talking to each other, are not talking to each other, sorry, and they're certainly not collaborating. We contend that AI can be made to be generative, beautiful, not merely ethical, but rationally compassionate and just, enriching our lives beyond what we can currently imagine. But it will only do so if civil society, including citizens living at the margins, and people involved in all kinds of social good pursuits, artists, teachers, health professionals, social workers, become much more interested and involved. So I have more notes about AI. I will skip to just the kind of the AI money shot, which is a quote from Nick Bostrom, director of the Future of Humanity Institute at Oxford University, who notes, perhaps hyperbolically, that machine intelligence is the last invention that humanity will ever need to make. Millennia from now, people will look back and note that the one thing we did that really mattered, we got right. It follows then that getting this invention right from a social responsibility standpoint may be the most important existential public policy, philanthropic goal we can possibly pursue. We heard a lot about systems as well. That's a phrase, systems change, is a concept that I've proudly and unapologetically drank the Kool-Aid on. The Palix Foundation shared their story about the Alberta Family Wellness Initiative. Trico and McConnell spoke about human-centered storytelling and through the Oxford-based Map the System student competition, which, full disclosure, is a competition that our institute at MRU runs. The root idea of philanthropos, the Greek word from which we derive and describe the work of everyone in this room, is not merely a love of humanity, but it is a love of the essences that make us human. Well, what is more fundamentally human than culture and art? Marshall McLuhan said that art is a distant early warning system, and this is why civic investment in the arts is such a vital part of philanthropy. Marie-Rosée de Coquet reminds us community vibrancy and resilience is directly connected to a strong art sector. In Creative Calgary, that the Rosée Foundation supports, is about systems, cross-sector collaboration, and about public policy. Philanthropy is perhaps underappreciated for its transformative role. It has forged and funded new networks, community leadership, and public policy. But it's at a crossroads, and President Jean-Marc Mangin, PFC president, observed in his first 100 days of traveling the country, made us all do sticky notes, vote on the wall. He's asking us, are we ready to confront polarization, to forge new relationships, engage technological innovation, and think differently about outcomes, including through a systems lens? Solutions to our most vexing problems are complex, but they do exist. Tiny Greta Thunberg, speaking 3 weeks ago in New York, thundered, "The eyes of all future generations are upon you, and if you choose to fail us, I say we will never forget you." Mayor Nenshi echoed this. Human societies need not follow prescribed patterns. We can shift our norms, assumptions, behaviors, and policies and design our way to a much better future. We do have choices. In fact, we have nothing but choices. So 3 questions I'll leave you with. How will philanthropy create prosperity for communities in a carbon-constrained world? How will it help rescue and strengthen democracy in a truth-constrained world? And finally, how do we need to change our networks, our institutions, and ourselves to get there? So thank you. Merci beaucoup.